I'll just do it, But it's very weird. It's like this weird, like inner battle between like this wish to be authentic and yourself and, ideals be damned.
There was a time when Mira Sorvino seemed impossible to ignore, a presence that defined a very specific moment in 1990s Hollywood, where intelligence, charm, and emotional depth could still create a star almost overnight. When she stepped onto that stage and accepted the Academy Award for her performance in Mighty Aphrodite, it felt less like a peak and more like a beginning. The kind of moment audiences remember for decades because it promises something bigger still to come. A career that would stretch forward, growing stronger with each role, each year, each new chapter. But that future never arrived in the way anyone expected, and that is where the story begins to shift from celebration to something far more unsettling. Because within just a few short years, the momentum slowed in ways that did not make sense. The roles became smaller. The visibility faded, and the name that once seemed destined to stay at the top of Hollywood quietly drifted into the background, leaving audiences with a question that lingered far longer than the headlines ever did. A question that never quite found a clear answer at the time: what happened to Mira Sorvino? Hollywood has always been a place where careers can change overnight, but even by those standards, this felt different, less like a natural decline, and more like something guided from behind the scenes, something shaped by forces the audience could not see, decisions made in rooms far away from the stage. Cameras where influence mattered more than talent, and reputation could be rewritten without warning. Over time, fragments of the truth began to surface, not all at once, but slowly, carefully, revealing a pattern that pointed not to one moment, but to a series of connections, a network of power that determined who would rise and who would be pushed aside. This is not simply the story of a rising star who lost her way. It is the story of 5 men whose names intersect with the most critical turning points of her career. Men who opened doors, redirected opportunities, and in some cases, ensured that those doors would never open again. The real question is no longer why Mira Sorvino disappeared from the spotlight, but whether she was ever given the chance to remain there in the first place. To understand what happened to Mira Sorvino, you have to go back to where her story truly begins, long before the red carpets and award speeches, long before Hollywood ever decided what to do with her. She was born on September 28, 1967 in New York City, into a family that already understood the industry from the inside. Her father, Paul Sorvino, was a respected actor, known for his powerful presence, a man who had built his career through discipline and persistence. And from an early age, Mira was exposed to both the beauty and the harsh realities of that world. But what made her different was not just where she came from, it was how she prepared herself. She attended Harvard University studying East Asian studies, graduating with honors, and becoming fluent in multiple languages. A level of intellectual depth that set her apart in an industry that often valued image over substance. She was not the typical Hollywood story, not someone who simply arrived and was discovered, but someone who worked quietly, deliberately, building a foundation that suggested a long and meaningful career ahead. Her early years in Hollywood were not easy, and success did not come instantly. There were smaller roles, overlooked performances, moments where it seemed like she might simply become another talented actress who never quite found the right opportunity. And then came the turning point, her collaboration with Woody Allen in Mighty Aphrodite, a role that would change everything. Her performance was raw, unexpected, deeply human, and it resonated not just with audiences, but with the Academy itself, earning her the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. At that moment, Mira Sorvino was no longer an emerging talent. She was a proven star, someone the industry should have built around, someone audiences trusted and wanted to see more of. She had the rare combination of intelligence, emotional range, and authenticity that could sustain a career for decades. And yet, almost immediately after reaching that peak, something began to shift. The roles that should have followed never quite arrived in the way they should have. The momentum slowed in ways that did not align with her talent or her success, and the trajectory that once seemed so clear began to fracture. Because in Hollywood, success is not always determined by what happens on screen. Sometimes it is shaped by forces far beyond it, by relationships, by influence, and by decisions made quietly behind closed doors. And in Mira Sorvino's case, those forces would soon begin to reveal themselves, one connection at a time. Number 5. Brad Pitt. There was at least one moment in Hollywood when someone refused to stay quiet, and it didn't happen in front of cameras or on a red carpet. It happened behind closed doors where power usually protects itself. Long before the wider world understood what was happening around Harvey Weinstein, there were already quiet warnings moving through the industry. Stories that never fully surfaced, but were serious enough to reach the right people. One of those moments involved Brad Pitt and Gwyneth Paltrow, who at the time was rising fast in Hollywood and was also in a relationship with Pitt. Like many young actresses of that era, she found herself in a situation that felt wrong, the kind of situation powerful men assumed they could control without consequences. But this time, the outcome shifted. When Pitt learned what had happened, he didn't look away or dismiss it. He confronted Weinstein directly, making it clear, in no uncertain terms, that certain lines could not be crossed, and for that moment, it worked. But that is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because nothing else changed. Weinstein did not lose his influence, he did not lose his power, and he certainly did not lose his ability to shape careers across Hollywood. The system absorbed that confrontation and continued exactly as it had before, untouched in any meaningful way. And that is where the connection to Mira Sorvino becomes impossible to ignore. Because Sorvino did not have someone like Pitt stepping in at the exact moment it mattered. She did not have that layer of protection when decisions about her career were being quietly influenced behind the scenes. In an industry where a single label can follow you from one studio to the next, where being described as difficult can close doors you never even knew existed, the absence of that protection can be devastating. Brad Pitt's role in this story is not about failure. In many ways, it represents one of the rare moments where someone with enough influence chose to push back. But it also exposes a deeper truth, that individual resistance was never enough to challenge a system designed to protect itself. One confrontation could change a single outcome, but it could not rewrite the rules of an industry built on silence, reputation, and power. So, the question remains. If someone could stand up and make a difference in one moment, why did that difference never extend beyond it? And how many others were left to face the consequences alone? Number 4. Meryl Streep. There is a different kind of discomfort that comes not from what was done, but from what was allowed to continue, and it often sits at the very top of the industry, in places where influence is strongest and silence carries the most. Wait, because if one man could shape careers the way Harvey Weinstein did, then the question slowly shifts away from him alone and toward the environment that surrounded him. The people who worked near him spoke about him, praised him, and helped define his place in Hollywood without ever fully challenging what was happening beneath the surface. At the center of that uncomfortable space stands Meryl Streep, not as a direct participant in any wrongdoing, but as a symbol of something far more complex, a figure whose voice carried enormous respect and whose words reflected the tone of an entire era. For decades, Streep represented the very best of Hollywood discipline, talent, integrity, a standard that audiences trusted without question, and when someone like that publicly acknowledged Weinstein in positive terms, it reinforced his legitimacy in a way that went far beyond business relationships. It told the industry and the audience that this was someone to be respected, someone to be trusted, someone whose influence was not only accepted but celebrated. And that is where the tension begins to build, because hindsight changes everything. When the truth about Weinstein eventually came to light, it forced a different kind of reflection, not just on what he had done, but on how long he had been able to do it, and how many people had crossed paths with him during that time without the system ever truly breaking. Streep herself would later state that she was not aware of the full extent of his actions, a response that many accepted, but one that also left a lingering question that has never fully gone away. In an industry built on relationships, on constant interaction, on reputations that travel faster than facts, how much was truly unknown and how much was simply never spoken out loud? For someone like Mira Sorvino, this kind of environment creates a different kind of pressure, one that does not come from a single individual but from an entire system that continues to function as if nothing is wrong. Because when powerful voices remain silent, intentionally or not, that silence becomes part of the structure itself, reinforcing the idea that challenging it comes with consequences. And in that kind of system, it is not always the most talented who succeed. but the ones who are able or willing to navigate it without resistance. So, the question becomes more complicated than it first appears, because it is no longer just about who did something wrong, it is about who had the power to change the outcome and chose not to, or perhaps never realized that they could. And if the most respected voices in Hollywood did not disrupt the system when it mattered, then what chance did anyone else really have? Number 3. Gwyneth Paltrow. Sometimes, the most uncomfortable stories in Hollywood are not about what is hidden, but about what is visible, right in front of everyone, creating a contrast that is impossible to ignore once you start looking closely. Because while some careers quietly slow down and disappear, others shaped by the same environment continue to rise, collect awards, and build legacies that seem untouched by the same forces operating behind the scenes. And nowhere is that contrast more striking than in the case of Gwyneth Paltrow. Like many actresses of her generation, Paltrow had her own encounter with Harvey Weinstein early in her career, an experience she would later speak about, publicly confirming that she too had faced a situation that felt deeply wrong. In that sense, her story intersects directly with the same system that would later be linked to Mira Sorvino. But from that shared starting point, their paths begin to separate in a way that raises difficult questions rather than offering clear answers. Because in the years that followed, Paltrow's career did not stall, it accelerated. She continued to land, major roles remained visible in high-profile projects, and ultimately reached her own defining moment when she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Shakespeare in Love, a film produced under the same powerful system that dominated that era of Hollywood. To audiences watching at the time, it looked like the natural progression of a rising star. Another success story in an industry built on momentum. But looking back, knowing what we know now, that progression feels more complicated. Because if two actresses could exist within the same system, both encountering the same powerful figure, yet emerge with completely different outcomes, then the explanation cannot be as simple as talent or timing. It suggests that something else was at play, something less visible but far more influential, shaping decisions about who would continue to receive opportunities and who would slowly be pushed to the margins. And that is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable, because it forces a question that Hollywood has never fully answered. For Mira Sorvino, the years after her breakthrough did not bring the same momentum, not the same opportunities, not the same steady climb that seemed almost effortless for others. Instead, there were gaps, missed roles, projects that never materialized, a gradual shift that audiences noticed but could not explain. And when placed beside Paltrow's trajectory, that difference no longer feels coincidental, it feels deliberate, or, at the very least, influenced by forces that operated beyond the control of the actresses themselves. So the question lingers, growing heavier with time. Why did one career continue to rise within the same system that seemed to hold another back? And what does that say about how that system truly decided who would succeed and who would be left behind? Number 2. Quentin Tarantino. There is a different kind of tension that comes not from power itself, but from proximity to it. From being close enough to see what others cannot yet, choosing, for whatever reason, not to act in a way that could change the outcome. And in the world surrounding Harvey Weinstein, few figures were closer professionally and creatively than Quentin Tarantino. For years, Tarantino's most celebrated films were released through the very system Weinstein controlled. A partnership that defined an entire era of independent cinema and elevated both men to iconic status. At the time, it was seen as a creative alliance, a director with a bold voice, and a producer with the power to bring that vision to the world. But with hindsight, that relationship takes on a different tone, because Tarantino was not an outsider looking in. He was inside the system, working closely with the man at its center. And years later, when the broader truth began to surface, Tarantino acknowledged that he had been aware of certain behaviors, not necessarily the full extent, but enough to know that something was wrong, enough to recognize that the rumors were not baseless. That admission changes the way the story is understood, because it introduces a question that is far more difficult than simple blame. It is not about whether Tarantino created the system or benefited from it. It is about what responsibility comes with knowing even partially that something harmful is taking place. In an industry where influence is everything, where a single voice can shift perception or open doors, silence becomes more than absence. It becomes a form of participation, whether intentional or not. And this is where the connection to Mira Sorvino becomes more complex and more unsettling. Because if those closest to power were aware even in fragments, then the possibility existed, at least in theory, for the trajectory of certain careers to be different. A warning, a refusal, a public stance, any of these could have disrupted the quiet mechanisms that shaped reputations behind the scenes. But those disruptions did not happen. Not in a way that altered the system while it was still in motion. For Sorvino, that absence matters, because the system she was navigating was not just controlled by one man, it was sustained by a network of relationships, collaborations, and unspoken agreements that allowed it to function without interruption. And when those within that network chose not to challenge it, whether out of uncertainty, fear, or calculation, the consequences extended beyond a single moment, shaping careers in ways the audience would only understand years later. So the question becomes unavoidable, and perhaps uncomfortable, for an industry built on creative freedom and bold voices. When you know something is wrong, even if you do not know everything, what does it mean to remain silent, and how many outcomes are quietly decided because that silence is never broken? Number 1. Harvey Weinstein. In the end, every thread in this story leads back to the same place, not to a moment, not to a rumor, but to a man whose influence reached so deeply into Hollywood that it could shape careers without ever appearing on screen. For years, Harvey Weinstein was more than a producer. He was a gatekeeper, someone who could decide which projects moved forward, which performances were celebrated, and which names would be quietly removed from consideration before the public ever knew they were in the running. His power was not loud, it did not need to be, because it operated through conversations, recommendations, and reputations that traveled faster than facts. For Mira Sorvino, that power became personal. Over time, she would reveal that her interactions with Weinstein were not just uncomfortable but defining moments where refusing to comply came with consequences that were never stated openly but were felt in everything that followed. Opportunities began to shift, roles that once seemed within reach disappeared, and a pattern emerged that was difficult to explain from the outside, but unmistakable from within. It was not a single event that changed her trajectory. It was a series of quiet decisions, each one small on its own, but together powerful enough to redirect an entire career. What makes this story even more unsettling is how invisible that process was to the audience. From the outside, it looked like a natural change, an actress who simply did not maintain her early momentum, another example of how unpredictable Hollywood can be. But behind that appearance was a system where influence could redefine perception, where being labeled as difficult or problematic could spread through the industry without proof, without context, and without any way to challenge it. And once that label took hold, it did not matter how talented you were or what you had already achieved, the opportunities would simply stop appearing. Years later, when the broader truth about Weinstein finally became public, it reframed not just individual stories, but an entire era. What once seemed like coincidence began to look like a pattern, one that extended far beyond a single actress. Sorvino's experience was no longer an isolated case. It was part of a much larger reality, one where power was used not only to create success, but to deny it. And by the time that reality was acknowledged, the damage had already been done. Careers, altered, paths changed, opportunities lost in ways that could never fully be restored. This is why her story still resonates, especially with those who remember her at the height of her talent, because it challenges a belief that Hollywood has always tried to maintain that success is earned purely through ability and hard work. In this case, the evidence suggests something very different, that sometimes success is allowed and sometimes it is taken away. And that leaves one final question, the kind that does not fade easily. How many careers were never allowed to fully exist, not because they lacked talent, but because someone with enough power decided they should not? Looking back now, the story of Mira Sorvino feels less like a mystery and more like something that was always there, just out of reach, hidden behind the way Hollywood presents itself to the world. For those who remember her at her peak, that moment when she stood on stage after Mighty Aphrodite and seemed destined for a long and remarkable career, the years that followed never quite made sense. It did not feel like a natural decline, it did not feel like a choice. It felt like something had been interrupted, something that should have continued but didn't. What makes this story stay with people is not just what happened, but how long it took for any part of it to be understood. For years, the audience saw only the surface, a career that slowed down, roles that became less visible, a name that gradually faded from the center of Hollywood conversation. But beneath that surface, There was a different reality, one shaped by power, by silence, and by decisions made far away from the screen. Decisions that could change everything without ever being explained. And even now, with more of the truth revealed than ever before, there is still a sense that the full story can never be completely known. Because what was lost cannot be measured only in roles or awards, it exists in the space between what was and what could have been. The performances that were never given, the opportunities that never arrived, the career that might have unfolded in a very different way if even a few moments had gone differently. Hollywood has changed in many ways since then, or at least it claims to have. But stories like this remain a reminder that the industry has always been shaped by more than talent alone. It has been shaped by influence, by relationships, and by the choices of those who hold power, whether they act or remain silent. So in the end, the question is not simply whether Mira Sorvino was forgotten. It is whether she was ever truly given the chance to stay, or if the decision had already been made long before the audience realized she was gone.